Never clap at the beginning, it might be rubbish. Remember the England game earlier in the week. I have the unenviable duty of introducing a man who needs no introduction. So therefore, you might think that mine is an easy task. And logically, it would be, except for the fact that on this occasion, he has specifically requested that we don't celebrate him too much. So I, for instance, wouldn't be allowed to tell you that he's probably the world's greatest living broadcaster, nor that he's a man whose public passion for wildlife has done more than any other has ever and probably will ever do to draw the world's attention to the plight of its creatures. That would be, well, I've just made the mistake of celebrating him, haven't I? I've immediately let him down. But then again, when we say Sir David Attenborough, it immediately conjures that person. It's a bit like Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong is the man of the moon. Sir David Attenborough is global conservation. And in fact, this morning I noticed that when I was typing a message on my phone to my father, the prescriptive text, when I put in ATT, came up with Attenborough. So even Apple knows of the man's status. It's difficult to not, therefore, celebrate him. But I'm going to try by not calling him Sir David Attenborough. I don't think I can go to Dave. I think Dave is probably just a little bit too familiar. But today we might just enjoy the company of David. But before we do, let's take a little look at how his passion for wildlife first came to our attention in the 1950s and how our passion for that wildlife has grown through his. David Attenborough has grown through an age where technology has made enormous advances. But today it's just failed him. And I'm sure that behind those curtains are a group of people doing everything they can to rectify the sound issues which we're encountering at this point in time. Do not adjust your sets. Please offer a very warm welcome for one day only, David. That wasn't the start we were hoping for, was it?
Oh, I don't know. There'll be quite enough of my words, I dare say, by the time we finish.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Good, yeah, very good, very well indeed. What are you up to then?
Making programs. We found the remains of an ichthyosaur, these prehistoric marine reptiles, down in Lyme Regis. I didn't, but Chris Moore, the paleontologist there. And we just got the paddles, front limbs, and they're quite different from any other ichthyosaur paddles known. So the likelihood is that this is a new species, maybe a new genus, and it's probably about 18 feet long. So it's so close to Bristol and the Natural History Units, the obvious thing to do is whenever they find a new detail or something, we'll whiz down there and get it. And we just started. Well, we started the introductory programs yesterday, and next week we'll start digging it out.
I heard yesterday from a salmon I was working with, actually, that next week you're going to be hanging off a cliff in Dorset.
Well, that will be next week. Yeah.
Well, I look forward to that. And paleontology is something that we've both been passionate about for ages. Dinosaurs becoming extinct. A couple of weeks ago, well, a month ago perhaps, Nanotyrannus became extinct. So here, a dinosaur that we had classified as a separate species of Tyrannosaur has turned out to become a juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex.
I think that's nice. I mean, well, because it brings to life the fact that these were living animals. Brings to life the fact that they had life histories, that they started off as eggs, that they were male and female, that they produce young. And it's one of the interesting things about paleontology is that you're linking up all these bits of knowledge which you had. And of course, in the old days, you'd find a leg and then you'd find an arm, and people would call the arm one thing and the leg another thing. And it wouldn't be until maybe 50 years later that you find a specimen that actually linked the two. So you've got one animal. That's progress.
It is. It's fantastic. We still won't, I don't think in our lifetimes, know everything about them. I mean, T-Rex has got feathers, though.
Oh, I think we've known about that for a long time. Yeah. And very exciting too. And I was lucky enough to be in China, go and see all those original specimens, which is great. But I think the marvelous thing about fossils for us as naturalists is that these days, quite right and proper, you're not allowed to collect anything which you can't collect. Birds' eggs, you can't collect butterflies. You have to be careful about picking flowers. But you can every now and again, except in very specific areas, pick up fossils. And you can begin to learn about classification, begin to learn about taxonomy, begin to learn about some perspective on the history of life. That's thrilling. And I started when I don't know when you were, how old you were, I was 8. And I had some good stuff, actually. I don't mind telling you. I lived on the Lias in Leicestershire, which is very close to the Jurassic up there. And I've got a lot of good stuff.
You see, young naturalists have that thirst for knowledge and to collect things. I mean, I had tadpoles stewing on my windowsill and newts dehydrating behind the radiators at a time that you had started to explore the world and were collecting animals for zoos.
Yes, and looking back on it now, you feel odd about it. But back in the 1950s, you were just at the tag end of that bit of history of zoology, where people were just beginning to feel that they got things classified, that they got the taxonomy right. They're stopping, maybe the time has come now to stop making lists. And I remember when I was in the London Zoo in the 50s, zoos actually measured their success internationally by how many different species they had alive. And there was a house in Regent's Park called the Small Mammal House, and it was about the size of this stage. And there were cages all the way around the wall and down the aisles and so on. And there was a nest box at the back with a little hole in it, a bit of straw and so on. And you couldn't see a single animal because they were nocturnal. They were all sleeping in the sleeping boxes. But they all had separate names on them, you see. And that was when you were classifying things. Well, we've got over that now. But in those days, in zoos, if they lost an anteater, there's plenty more, go and catch one, bring it back. And the idea, the notion that the natural world could be under danger from man's collecting activity was completely nonsense, and nobody could imagine that could be the case. The ocean was so infinitely wide, the rainforest was so enormously big and rich. How could little man make an effect? Well, of course, now, to our cost and to our shame, we know very well that man makes a huge effect, but then you didn't. And so I was there, the first film I ever made, a natural history film, was to go accompanying an expedition from the London Zoo to go and collect rare birds in Sierra Leone.
I think we've got a clip. Let's dare to run it and see if the sound works. Of you tracing Picathartes. Let's have a look.
We spent weeks travelling around the country collecting all kinds of mammals, reptiles and birds. Everywhere we went, we showed people a picture of Picathartes and finally found a village chief who said the birds nested nearby. And so they did. In the finished programmes, of course, we didn't reveal this immediately. Instead, we ended each by saying, "So we went on to look for Piccathartes."
We took our places behind the hide. And now came the most tense moment of the expedition, the moment for which we'd all waited so long. Would we see the adult birds? And then, suddenly, we saw one, a few yards away in the twilight of the bush, preening itself. This was enormous excitement. Then up it fluttered onto the nest, and as it did so, the other parent flew across and drove the first one away. This was a great thrill for us, for as this happened, we became the first Europeans ever to see the white-necked Piccathartes on its nest.
Exciting to be out there.
Yes, but it's a bit vainglorious, isn't it? A bit adolescent. We were the first people to see them.
Hold on a moment. I seem to remember you celebrating being the first person to see things throughout the course of your career. It didn't stop with your adolescence.
First one to film things will be
Film
better.
things, indeed, yeah. But it must have been tremendously exciting.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Of course, you can say what you like about zoos and collecting things, but there was a huge skill in those days of people who knew how to look after birds and mammals and reptiles and amphibians and so on, who had the equivalent of green fingers. And there was a chap called Alf Woods, who was the head keeper of the birdhouse in London Zoo, came with us. And he just knew how to handle birds, young birds. He knew how to feed young birds. And that is a skill which these days, when it's intolerable, or many people think it's intolerable to keep birds in aviaries, that's a skill that's disappearing. It's a pity.
Coming to the end of that period when you were out collecting those animals, enjoying it and celebrating it, and as a naturalist, I can imagine it was tremendously exciting. But did you enjoy a sort of epiphany? Did you get to a point when you thought, actually, this isn't all limitless? There aren't an innumerable number of specimens to be collected. What was that point where, all of a sudden, your fascination for life gave you an awareness of the need to conserve it?
Oh, very clearly. I mean, the co-founder of this very festival, Sir Peter Scott, was the first naturalist to sound the clarion call about the fact that human beings were making animals extinct. Well, he was certainly the first naturalist to say we've got to do something about it. He was a great aviculturist. Again, he started off by collecting wildfowl, and he knew about the Hawaiian goose. And it was reduced to two figures, 60 or 70 or something of that sort. And they recognized that the way they were going to save this, the only way they would save it, is to take them into captivity and rear them. But it wasn't until that happened that I think the general public even dawned on them that humanity could be so devastating on the natural world and to exterminate things. Of course, the examples were there. I mean, the dodo was there in the 18th century, 17th century, disappeared. The quagga was there, disappeared. But nobody seemed to mind much at that stage. But the thought that we were still doing it started a ball rolling, which produced, of course, the World Wildlife Fund, produced this festival and many, many other things as well.
So this was late 50s, early 60s. Well, the World Wildlife Fund came to formation in 61, I think, yes, didn't it, with Peter and others?
And that was a remarkable thing which Peter did, from Slimbridge, just up the road. There were other people, let's get it straight, there were other people internationally as well as
Gerald Durrell?
Yes. Well, Jerry was my age, actually. So he was younger, really, than the founders of the World Wildlife Fund, who had nous, they knew how to get things done. There was a marvelous man, Max, what's his name, forgotten, but who knew the right buttons to press to get governments to do things, And that was what really started, and it was a worldwide thing, of course. WWF, although it was one of its beginnings was right here, saw itself as being a worldwide organization, thank goodness, and it now is. And it's a major force. And I think that Peter Scott and the part that this country played in getting that off the ground is very important.
And of course, we now celebrate Peter Scott and his partners there. How were they perceived at the time, though? Were they seen as slightly radical?
Not radical so much as kind of tolerated as being slightly cranky, you know. Who do we care if the Hawaiian goose disappears? And actually that remained for a long time. It was a very valuable thing for the conservation movement to focus its attention on one particular species that's going to be in danger. And a lot of the public imagination was captured by doing that. But actually, they were just tokens, they were just flagships for a bigger disaster that was on the way. And it was that the World Wildlife Fund addressed, and it was that eventually began to seep through to the public consciousness, that we aren't just talking about an oddball bird that nobody else particularly cared about, but actually destroying whole ecosystems, and that the oceans of the world were in real danger. Imagine, when I was a boy, the idea that you could damage the ocean was intolerable. I mean, there were cities in this country that were pouring raw sewage into the sea in this country in the 20s and 30s on the grounds that, you know, the ocean was big, it was all washed away. And if you had said to the people in the 20s and 30s, we can be acidifying the oceans and we can be destroying coral reefs, people would have thought you were crazy.
One of the first focus of WWF was Galapagos, wasn't it? And they went to Galapagos, and you followed in the footsteps and met the tortoises there. And one tortoise in particular, when you spoke of totems, as it were, was Lonesome George.
Yes. As you know, the islands, there are a dozen or so islands in the Galapagos of some size, and most of them had their own species, or subspecies at any rate, of tortoise on it. Some with different shaped shells and so on, and it was that caused Darwin to start thinking. But a great proportion of those other species, or the smaller species, were exterminated by shipping, which came and captured the tortoises, take them away as living fresh meat, which they could take on their voyage for 3 weeks and still get fresh meat, very tempting. And there was known that a number of those were extinct. And then from one of the far north islands, someone was doing a survey and they discovered there living was one old guy, one old male tortoise. All the rest had been extinct from his island. He was the last. I mean, by definition, there could be no rarer living animal than that, the last living example of one particular species. And so he was brought back. Nobody knew, of course, how old he was, because how could you know? It was just a guess. He was very, very old. And they had, of course, no females from the same species, so they introduced him to various others, but he was very old. and he just sort of blinked, you know. Nothing happened, and then I filmed him, I think, 15 years ago or something.
I think we've got a clip. Let's have a little clip.
This is Lonesome George. It was hoped that a female pinter tortoise might be found with which he could breed, but it was not to be. Lonesome George, it seems, is doomed to be the last of his kind. Sadly, he died in June 2012. Just another one gone, and another one on the conscience of humanity.
After the Galapagos, WWF were up and running, but there were still many problems, and one of the creatures that you encountered, and a remarkable encounter drew immediate attention to, was the mountain gorillas, of course. And I think we've got a photograph. Here we are. Let's have a look. There can't be a living soul that's interested in natural history that hasn't witnessed this. You're tickling fit with a gorilla.
Yeah. Well, the first thing to be said, of course, is that that couldn't have happened without Diane Fossey, a very, very remarkable woman who spent her life, who lived up there with these, and protected these mountain gorillas, not lowland gorillas, mountain gorillas. And she had that's her, and she had so habituated them that they allowed her to sit among them. And we were invited, we asked if we could go, and she gave us permission. And so we went up there, and we did all the things that we were supposed to do, you know, which is to expose yourself so the gorillas know that you're there. You might not see them, but you could hear them. And so you wanted to look in a obvious place, preferably with Diane. And they would sort of clock that and say, you know. And then, don't push it, next day come back. And next day we did come back. And this time I went across to do actually a perfectly scientific sequence, which you would appreciate, which was about a stage in evolution where mankind got the opposable thumb. And of course, that was among the primates, enable you to grip branches. But the opposable thumb would also allow you to use tools. And so that was a key point in the history of humanity. And I was supposed to go and do that. And we could see them in the mid-distance. And I crawled up with them at the back of me, with the cameras over there, as it were, and was just about to address camera when I felt a real heavy weight on my head. And it was a huge hand. A female had come out of the bush and was turned my head to look straight in my eyes. And then she put her finger in my mouth. And I thought that wasn't the moment to talk about the opposable thumb. And I sat there for a long time. And she explored me, and her baby gorillas came out and sat on my feet. I was in paradise, really, as you will well know, anybody you would have met. And eventually the babies gambled off, and she heaved herself up and moved away. And I went back to the crew and said, whew, gosh, wasn't that amazing? And John Sparks, who was the director, said, I think we got perhaps a minute or so. And I said, a minute or so? You can't be serious. I was there for about 10 minutes or something. He said, well, the thing was, we didn't have all that amount of film on the camera, and also I did think it looked a bit like sort of Blue Peter, really, when the people wouldn't think that they were wild gorillas, and I was saving the footage for your explanation about the opposable thumb. So that's more or less all we got. Well, not quite.
So we lost a bit of evolution, but we got a sequence which actually, in terms of wildlife television, is possibly the most celebrated. And it drew attention to a species which was in big trouble, because at the time, mountain gorillas were a rare animal. In fact, in one of your programs, I think you said that the only thing standing between their extinction at that point was Diane Fossey. Between them and extinction was Diane Fossey. She was a remarkable woman then.
Oh, absolutely. And the marvelous thing is, we've got lots of bad stories and tragedies. But there are twice as many mountain gorillas now alive today than there were then. And that's because they embraced the idea of ecotourism. And they get small groups of people who are fit and can do the trip and are responsible, and they take them up in groups, and they actually encounter these gorillas. They're not allowed to touch them, quite right too, because of the problem of diseases and so on. But they come and they pay a lot, so that the income from the mountain gorillas is a significant, if not the greatest, export foreign currency into the country, into Rwanda. So the local people feel the benefit, and the local people now protect the gorillas. And it is an important element. In my view, ecotourism can be of course it can be badly handled, but if it's properly handled, the Galapagos is the same. The Galapagos, the mountain gorillas, are important sources of income, and why local people would welcome them there and look after them and care for them.
I know we're not meant to be celebrating yourself too much today, but she did set you a challenge, because she was very ill at the time you were filming. And she said, will you do something for me? Will you help me conserve these animals? And you were instrumental in setting up the Mountain Gorilla Fund, I think, which again, at this point, was the Mountain Gorilla Fund. So it was very much focused on a single species, albeit a flagship species. And this was part and parcel of what, for me, was early conservation in the 1960s. It was Project Tiger, Save the Whale, Save the Gorilla. It was all single species conservation at that point, wasn't it?
Yes, certainly. And as I was saying earlier, these flagship species are very useful in focusing public imagination and people who aren't perhaps particularly aware of the complexity of the natural world. But we have moved on from then. I mean, I think every responsible conservation organization that I can think of knows very well that actually you really can't save a species unless you save the ecosystem. A rhinoceros is not a rhinoceros if it's put into a concrete pit. It's a prisoner, and it bears very little relationship to what the real rhinoceros is. The rhinoceros lives out there, an ecosystem on the plain. Mountain gorilla is part of ecosystem. If it's the ecosystems that are the key, it is the ecosystems that we must save, because with them, certainly if we're talking about a tropical rainforest, you aren't just talking about a mammal, you're talking about plants, you're talking about insects, you're talking about reptiles, you're talking about birds, you're talking about the whole thing. And that is the basic objective, the basic target that you have to go for if you're really going to talk about conservation. And of course, in the end, those ecosystems will join up if we are successful, so that we begin to realize that that little blue ball in the blackness of space is one ecosystem. It's called the world, and it's in our hands.
That almost warranted a round of applause, I thought. One of the ecosystems that you were very fortunate to explore, again going back to the 50s on ZooQuest, was Borneo.
Yes.
And we've got a clip here, which we'll play, of you out encountering another primate, in this time an orang-utan.
When I first came to Borneo in 1956, all this was rainforest. Now, all those trees have gone.
The logging industry took out the wood. The palm oil industry cleared what remained of the forest and replaced it with its own uniform plantations. All those extra human mouths have to be fed, and the country needs the cash. But the effect on the natural world has been catastrophic. It's all very well for us to say how terrible that is, and it is terrible. This marvelous, marvelous rainforest. It makes you weep to think of all the fantastic creatures that once lived there, and now nothing but oil palm. But why is there nothing but oil palm? The reason there's nothing but oil palm is that the people of Borneo need foreign exchange, and the world is thirsty for food. It needs all the food it can get. It needs oil, palm oil. And why is that? It's because the world's population is increasing hand over fist. I mean, okay, I don't feel I've been making broadcasting for all that length of time, but since we saw Picathartes to now, there are 3 times as many people on this small planet. 3 times as many. And where do they all need, like you and I leave, they need houses and they need roads and they need food for their children and themselves and they need Lebensraum of one sort or another. Of course they do. And where does that come from? Well, a certain amount comes from reclamation of urban despoiling or something. But a great deal of it comes from the natural world. So that a great deal of the natural world has been lost to the wild creatures of this world. And that is a major disaster.
Amongst I mean, we're moving out now of conservation into far broader themes, and you've struck on human population growth there. Is that the biggest challenge you think we face? Is that a bigger challenge, say, than climate change?
Well, the two things are inextricable. That is the point, that the growing population, greater densities of urban populations, produces all sorts of evils. I mean, urban violence, starvation, as well as the changes we're imposing on the atmosphere by the amount of carbon dioxide we are producing one way or another, either by breathing it or by burning fuel. However, having said that, it's easy to get very depressed. and I do. But you have to take a slightly longer view. Never in the history of humanity have all the nations of the world agreed on anything. Anything. Never. And so when people say, oh yes, there are these conferences in Paris or wherever it is, it's just George, that's true. But you can't expect the whole world to suddenly agree on something that is going to infect every one of them, and for different reasons. So I'm apprehensive, but I still don't think that we ought to despair by any manner of means. And I believe that if we can get together, we can find solutions, technical solutions, technological solutions, to a lot of the problems that we face, notably about energy production. And if we get together and get the developed countries of the world that have big research budgets and say, look, here is a roadmap from production of energy, from, say, the sun, the transmission of energy, and so that you don't lose a lot of it when it's transported from one end to another, storage of energy, and the generation right at the beginning. That sequence, we can work out where the difficulties lie and concentrate the research budgets, divide it up amongst themselves. Okay, we'll take this aspect of transmission. We will take that aspect of generation. Within 10 years, it will be absolutely possible to produce energy directly from the sun and the tides and the wind at, and this is the key thing, at a price which undercuts the carbon that we find, the oil and the coal. And then it isn't a question of saying to people, you mustn't do this and you mustn't do that, which is very difficult to enforce. They will do it themselves because it's cheaper. And that can be done. And there are people working hard to bring that about.
I believe you, of course, that could be done, but we still face this problem with this enormous growth in our own population.
Yes.
And I've got actually some books here as a suggested reading list for our young visitors today. So there's this book, Sapiens, which is well worth a read. It's basically a summation of where we've come from, who we are, and the impact that we have today. So I'd recommend that one. And then we've got E.O. Wilson's Future of Life, which is a pretty, well, it starts off very romantically with a letter that he's written effectively to Thoreau, another conservation pioneer. Future of Life, I would say, was a pretty optimistic look at what we've got wrong, but how we can get it right, by one of the world's greatest ecologists who you've had the pleasure of meeting. And then I would suggest, in its punk rock cover, that you go for 10 Billion by Stephen Emmett. And this book is punk rock not only by cover, but by content. This is very much a stab in the eye with a sharp stick. And I thought I might just read you the last couple of pages to give you a flavour of how serious this mathematician and sociologist thinks the problem is. He says on the fourth to last page, as I said at the beginning, we can rightly call the situation we're in an unprecedented emergency. We urgently need to do, and I mean actually do, something radical to avert a global catastrophe. But I don't think we will. I think we're effed. I asked one of the most rational, brightest scientists I know, a scientist working in this area, a young scientist, a scientist in my lab, if there was just one thing he had to do about the situation we face, what would it be? And his reply, teach my son how to use a gun. I'm not with him on that, actually. I think, well, I'm not for guns, actually. It starts there. But that's an incredibly pessimistic look at it. I think we're too resourceful, too intelligent, and too adaptable to completely mess things up. What do you think?
Well, I'm quite sure that almost every one of us in this room have seen a better world than any of our grandchildren will do. The world is going to be poorer, it's going to be more crowded, the weather's going to be more extreme, the seas are not going to be as productive. But I hope, for the reasons I was talking earlier, that humanity will come to its senses in a global way to handle these problems. And I believe that can be done. I believe it is being done. I believe that what the process I described about sorting out how to get energy from renewables at an economic cost will happen, and that will be a key to levelling out of the problems.
Just going back to conservation, because one of the things that you have had to endure in your short period of broadcasting is to witness extinction. And we've got a clip here from Life in Cold Blood when you went to Panama to look at golden frogs. I checked yesterday on the status of golden frog, and they're breeding really well in captivity, but there's no plans to put them back into the wild. And the reason, one of the reasons, is that the bacteria that live on their skin, which afford some protection to the chytrid fungus, have declined in captivity. So there's not the diversity of bacteria living on the frogs that there was when they were first taken from the wild. And because the conditions haven't changed at the site where they were in Panama, means they haven't put them back. What do you think about having animals which are extinct in the wild or gravitating to extinction just existing in captivity? Because it strikes me as terribly sad.
Yeah, of course it's sad. It depends on the animal. I mean, I think a little frog like that you could maintain in a reasonably large ecosystem in captivity and give a lot of joy to people and so on. So you would see a variety that once existed.
But it's not serving any ecological purpose.
No, it's not serving ecological purpose, but it's serving an imaginative purpose. And it's serving as a warning. It's serving as a lot of things that human beings could benefit from seeing it. And it's the only thing, what is the alternative under your scenario? Your scenario is that it's gone. Well, there are a heck of a lot of things that have actually gone that we've already forgotten. So it's probably just as well if we could just preserve some. And who knows when the conditions will change, whether that chytrid fungus will disappear or not, we don't know. So let's take every straw, clutch at every straw that we can, and realize that it may not be as successful as we might have wished.
On that account, on the 26th of September this year, Rab's tree frog, another Panamanian species, the last one in captivity, called Tuffy, proved not to be so tough. Rather like Lonesome George, he failed to breed with a female. Perhaps he too had exceeded the years. And he died. And they put that Rab into some sort of cryogenic storage now to store it for the future. But at this point in time, when we think of other animals, perhaps less easy to manage and breed and keep and house as frogs, things like tigers and rhino. When they do exist in captivity, there are far more tigers in captivity now than there are in the wild. Isn't it just I look at them and I think this is a desperately sad reminder of the place where these nature's masterpieces once played a valid ecological role. We're going to need a big ark, aren't we, to keep all of the creatures back to see if we can one day reintroduce them into habitats.
I don't think that's I agree with what you say, but it's not actually a problem that faces us now. The problem facing us now is to prevent things going extinct altogether. And we certainly know that actually the glib phrase of, we will return them to the wild, we'll breed them up and then return them, is just that. It's a glib phrase. Because the ecosystem itself, the sort of substrate of the ecosystem, changes. So, for example, the Hawaiian goose that we mentioned earlier with Peter Scott was instrumental, together with others, in saving. They took that back to Hawaii. But the trouble was that Hawaii itself had changed since those geese became extinct there. And what had been the lava fields where they were grazing, where they could find, were now a very different sort of situation they were faced with. And they took a very, very long time before they could even survive out there. So it's not easy. But okay, it's not easy. It doesn't mean to say you give up. And I think that the science of reintroduction and so on has improved a great deal since those days. I mean, particularly, take, for example, orangutan, big apes in Borneo. We now know that if you just took a baby orang that had been brought up in captivity and then said shoo and go, the poor thing wouldn't know what to do, because there are years spent in which its mother teaches this child, shows us how young springs, shows that this is good to eat and that is not. And that just to release them into the wild as like that is just committing them to starvation. So we are becoming wiser about these matters, and that's a good thing we are. But it's not simple, and I'm not suggesting it is.
Reintroductions are a tool, though, which, as you say, we have got a good grip on, and we've used them to great effect. In the UK, we've successfully put red kites back. The habitat wasn't sufficiently changed. They were a generalist predator. We have the largest population of red kites, the only growing population of red kites in Europe now, and they're doing incredibly well. In other parts of the world, they put wolves back into Yellowstone. They've changed the shape of rivers. The introduction of this top of the food chain predator has reshaped the environment and improved it in terms of its richness. So what about in the UK? People fantasize about wolf and lynx and so on and so forth?
Yes, and I live next door to Richmond Park, and we have a large population of red deer. And of course, every year at the right season, you hear the crack of guns because they are having to be thinned out, because there are no wolves to take to aged males out of the population. So that it's an artificial population. But I don't think on the Richmond Park that it would be a good idea to have a pack of wolves. Arguably in some part of Scotland where some extremely rich person owns an area the size of an English county, maybe. But is that significant in your sort of sense as you were asking, as you were criticizing before, or talking about before?
I'm playing devil's advocate. I'm very pro reintroduction. I think, obviously, Richmond Park, we can't have a wolf pack there. I think it would draw a lot of attention. I think there would be a lot of people. That would be perfect for ecotourism. You'd be swamped. You'd have to open your own burger van and reap the profits. But in other parts of the country, I think we're lagging behind. Most countries in Western Europe have reintroduced the beaver, but we still can't agree in the UK.
We are the most heavily populated part of Europe, aren't we?
I think the Netherlands have overtaken us.
Yeah, okay.
But it's close.
But it's close.
But they have lynx and beaver.
Yeah, okay, I don't think it's going to be, in your terms, or your rather stringent terms, about ecologically significant. I don't really see that it's anything more than pleasing ourselves that the beavers are in the West Country. And I've watched beavers, and I think they're the most engaging creatures, so I'm all in favor of beavers. But let's not confuse ourselves. We aren't recreating England in the west of England, Eden. We're not creating that just by getting beavers. We're pleasing ourselves.
Do we need to be braver, then, as conservationists, and say we can accept that we can't have that Eden, we can't have the biodiversity of your youth or of my youth, that we have to accept a new biodiversity. We need to imagine a new landscape which is productive in terms of the species that live there, which supports economically and socially the people who grow our food, so on and so forth. And therefore we stop crying about losses of skylarks and lapwings and grey partridges, and just accept the fact that in this part of the 21st century, we have to be more imaginative and less retrospective, less nostalgic.
Yes, I think I'd agree with that. I mean, the fact is the corncrake is disappearing and virtually gone. You would probably know facts and figures as to how many there are, but they're very, very few. And the reason is, again, you know, that the agricultural practices 150 years ago allowed the corncrake to nest in fields and rear its chicks, and the real population. And modern ways of producing food, which we need in increasing quantities because of the increasing of population, doesn't allow that. And so it seems that the corncrake is doomed. And I see no way of getting over that. You could, as you say, maintain a small group somewhere, but that's more for our interest and our delight. I mean, we're doing that with bustards, European bustards on the Salisbury Plain, similar sort of thing. But I'd love it. I mean, I would love to see a bustard striding across the road as I drove past. But it's an indulgence.
It's a vanity.
Yes.
So some of conservation's practices at the moment are vanities, and I couldn't agree more. I feel that sometimes the con in conservation is the fact that we are entreated to focus upon these small successes, the number of dormice that appear on the covers of our magazines, because we can breed them and successfully reintroduce them, but they don't play that ecologically important role. They can't, for the reasons that you've stated. So how does conservation therefore need to give up on this and concentrate on the bigger issues?
Chris, I think we're missing something. We are assuming that if it's good, it benefits us, and if it's bad, it damages us. There is another proposition, which is that the natural world existed before we were there. We are latecomers to it. And because we are so clever, we have now got its future in our hands. It's old-fashioned thinking to go on saying, and therefore we should do things that actually enhance our appreciation of it. There is an argument that the natural world was given and that we have no right to destroy it, and that we ought to do our best to preserve it, not just because it's more beneficial to us, but because in its own right, it has a right to exist.
But haven't you just hit upon the head there, the single greatest problem, and that is our, as we call it, anthropocentrism, the fact that it's all about us, and that we think that we are distinct from the natural world, that we are above it, that it's there for us to exploit at our behest. Do we not need to somehow or other get people to understand that we are as much a part of its ecology as every other species, that we are merely a part of that matrix, which can be so beautiful when it's sustainable and harmonious and functional? If we can get people to that point, then where they don't think that we're the be-all and end-all, just because we've got the opposable thumb that you never got round to telling us about, at that point, that's when we get our epiphany.
Yes. But you know, it's all very well, this business that it is, it pleases us. There is something beyond that, which is that the world did exist before we came, and that we have no right to destroy it. But the problem then comes when you say, well, what about river blindness? What about that little fluke that lives in West African rivers, and that which burrows into the eye of a small child sitting by its bank and inevitably blind it within the next 5 to 10 years? Have we the right to exterminate that? Or do we say in our curious way, oh no, we'll keep just a little there, because that's how it was, and that's how the world was when we arrived in there. The fluke can't live in any other way. So if you exterminate that, humanity will be better off. But so it's a moral problem. And so it isn't quite as easy as I was just oversimplifying 2 minutes ago and saying everything's got a right to exist. It's going to be mediated in some way. It's going to be changed in some way. It's going to be subtle in some way in which we handle it. But the overall argument that the natural world had existed before we came and we have no right to grossly transform it, I think remains.
And so it should. But here's another difficult question. What do we, you and I, and our audience, actually do to affect change? Weekend before last, in the middle of the night, I was crawling around on Cyprus, tearing nets down on a British base because the policing there is ineffective, and 2 million birds are killed there every year. So here is a 55-year-old man it's a legal activity, so I felt pretty tricky cutting the nets. You know, these are expensive things. We normally catch them for ringing birds. But here I was tearing them down, releasing the birds. You know, this was activism. And I thought to myself, why am I here? And it's because no one else was doing anything about it. It just got to the point where it's do it yourself or nothing will happen. Do you think we should return to that level of activism, which we saw was far more rampant in the 70s with Greenpeace? There's a bit of Sea Shepherd activity now in the southern seas. Do people need to go to Cyprus, crawl around the dark and tear down nets?
Well, it's the problem we're talking about is the problem, do you break the law?
Well, no, it's illegal to trap the birds, so I didn't feel too bad about tearing the illegal nets down.
Well, that was what I was going to say.
The Cypriot police are not on their way.
No, I was justifying you.
Right.
What I'm saying is that there are people who feel so profoundly, so strongly, so violently that they would do anything to protect some sort of creatures. And what I'm trying to say is that in the end we do live in a society that's governed by law, and that you have to be very careful when you actually decide that you are going to break the laws in order to pursue your point of view, because you are then inciting others to break the law because of their point of view. So you can't have it both ways. And it's a fine line. And the conservationists are treading close to it all the time. But I think you have to at least recognize what it is. And if you are going over it, recognize that you're going over it and thinking hard about it.
I don't think we should cross the line. I think that we have the opportunity to democratically oppose things which we perceive as destructive. And we can exercise that to promote discussion, debate, and therefore creative change. We sign our petitions, which is a democratic right that we have in the UK, to draw attention to issues which we feel are destructive in terms of environment, wildlife, and so on and so forth. But no, I'm obviously very, very much with you. Breaking the law is a step too far. It's counterproductive. But nevertheless, we don't see from generations that are present today, I don't think, that degree of passion which sets an alarm clock, which goes out to wave a banner or ties themselves to a tree, that we did in a certain part of our youth.
I'm not sure.
Was Peter Scott, was he an activist? Was Diane Fossey, was she an activist?
Oh, yes.
She was, wasn't she?
Oh, very much so. If you read the various biographies that have been published about her, you'll see that she did some very violent things to protect her gorillas. And that was a source of weakness in her argument. And she did violent things. So that's hard. And in the end, it was the seeds of our own destruction. But they lived beyond that. I mean, they got beyond that, and the rule of law has been restored. I can't help feeling sympathetic to Diane. I mean, she was a passionate woman, but she did overstep the mark every now and again.
She overstepped the mark, and I'm playing devil's advocate here because I'm not one for overstepping it, but in doing so, those gorillas are still there.
Absolutely so. Absolutely so.
So, again, going back to the original question then, what can we do ourselves? We have to be empowered to start to affect this change, don't we?
Well, let's just bring it to this festival. I mean, this festival is an example of what we can do. I don't think this is just an ordinary run-of-the-mill festival for film stars or whatever. I'm not denigrating film stars. But I seriously think that wildlife programming and filmmaking, television, is of crucial importance for the future of the world. I really do. The United Nations have said perfectly clearly that the majority of the human race is now urbanized. They live in cities. So the majority of the human race doesn't see a truly wild animal from one day to the next, unless it's a rat or a pigeon, and they aren't truly wild. We also know, because we are ecologically up to date, that we depend upon the natural world for every breath of air we take and every mouth of food that we eat. And so if we damage the natural world, we damage ourselves. And if the natural world is in peril, we are in peril. So what do you do about it as a world population? They should be aware of that. They should be aware of what the natural world is. They should be aware of the way the natural world works, at least to the degree to actually recognize when they're damaging it and when they're not. It is only if the human population of the world is brought with them to deal with this problem that we are all facing now, that there will be salvation. And one of the keys to that is what all you dear people from this festival are doing. I really, really mean that. I think it's of crucial importance.
So we have our film, one of the films that's in the festival, The Ivory Game, drawing attention, undercover filming, hard-hitting stuff about this issue, which only a week or so ago, an opportunity existed to basically put an end to the ivory trade. CITES decided not to take that step. So now we have a film which will, it's tough viewing, but we will watch it and be aware. So we're in the awareness game. That's your point. So one aspect of the awareness is that we celebrate the natural world. Do you think that television, outside the documentary that I've mentioned and other feature documentaries, do you think that television ought to be doing more hard-hitting conservation films? Because we don't do a lot, do we?
No, it's a question of proportion, but it's to the broadcasters' credit that we have been doing things about the dangers of conservation, the techniques of conservation, and the dangers that are facing us for a long, long time, certainly for 20, 30 years, to my knowledge, and we'll keep on doing that. But it would be a great mistake, as far as I'm concerned, if we actually thought that natural history broadcasting was only that. There is an important value in understanding the way the natural world works. And that's what our films can do. That's why it's important that what all of us are doing should be seen on the networks of the world. We have a fantastically privileged time, you and me, and I'm sure many of you there, that we go out and spend time in the natural world, up close, having a wonderful time and seeing what these things are. But we have an obligation to show what they are and show them truthfully to people who aren't as lucky as we.
A conduit of inspiration.
Absolutely. Showing
people the beauty. And through the manifestation of their awe, we can motivate them to take a proactive role in conservation. Before we finish, I took your name in vain in a small vessel off of the Sri Lankan coast in March. I'd gone there with my stepdaughter, who's here today, to photograph sperm whales.
Lucky you.
In the water.
Lucky you.
Remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. Here's one of the pictures I got.
Wow.
Yeah. However, amongst that population of sperm whales, there are occasionally blue whales. And as the boat headed in at the end of our last little journey, she said to me, she's 21, she said, "I'm really disappointed I didn't see a blue whale." And I said, "Hold on a moment. I know a man who waited 76 years to see a blue whale." We've got a clip here of you enjoying that moment. And if you don't mind me saying, the smile on your face in that clip was a conduit for inspiration. Your passion is unbounded, of course. But to draw it to a close, and the reason that I wanted to end on that clip was that you did say that you never thought you would see one of those animals because they might become extinct in your lifetime.
That's right.
But now we have a population of them which is growing.
Yes, and just to end on two points of hope, and contradict something I said earlier. I said never before in history had humanity come together to deal with any single problem. That's not actually quite true. Whatever it was, 15, 20 years ago, somebody, actually the British Antarctic Survey, noticed that there was a hole in the ozone layer. And scientists around the world recognized this problem. Scientists identified that it was CFCs coming from refrigerators and so on. the nations of the world, not with a great roll of drums, but they actually passed legislation to outlaw CFCs. That stopped the human race from being fried, and the ozone layer is slowly healing. So it can be done, and it must be done.
And to some extent we did it with these animals. IWC in '86, I think, finally put an end to the slaughter of the whales, and their population is slowly but surely growing.
The whale conservation is the second big example of nations getting together. And they've done it almost surreptitiously, actually. And what we now have to do is to persuade the nations of the world that it's got to become overt and they've got to do something which affects every man Jacobin.
And you saw your blue whale. Now, the last time we met, I showed you one of my prized possessions, a megalodon shark tooth, fossil shark tooth. I'm very proud of it. Well, it belongs to my stepdaughter, actually, but I borrowed it for the evening. I showed it to you, and you pulled one out that was double the size and twice as good.
Yeah.
That's fine. There's no hard feelings. And to prove there are no hard feelings, I've got you a little present.
Really?
Yeah. It's wrapped in a co-op bag, which isn't very auspicious. But when I saw this, I just thought, I know a man who will appreciate the beauty of this object. It's the intervertebral disc of not a blue whale, but of a fin whale. And when I picked that up, not only did I love the texture and the form of this piece of natural sculpture, but for me there was a great sense of romance, because I looked at this and I thought to myself, where had that whale been? What had that whale seen before it met its end on a beach in Orkney? Anyway, I'd like you to have that. If you have a shelf space for it, I'm sure, don't tell me you've got one double the size. Absolutely furious.
Oh, thank you very much.
It's lovely, isn't it? Really lovely. Stand up. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, David Attenborough.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. You're my friend.